Hello, everyone. My name is Yulia Svetikova, and I'm here today with wonderful Dorothy Zemach. Dorothy is an amazing person. She's a teacher trainer, a publisher, editor, an experienced material writer. And I'm really happy to ask her some questions today. So, Dorothy, you can say hello to our audience.
Hi. Thank you for having me and giving me a chance to talk. It is for me morning in the United States. So if you see me drinking out of a cup, that's me having my morning coffee, which I do every morning. So
yeah, that was pretty tricky counting, the time zone difference because you're switching to
yes, we switched to daylight saving time last night, 2 nights ago, which is 1 week after the rest of the world. Those countries that change. There's some talk that this might be the United States' last year of daylight saving time, and we might not do it anymore, but nobody knows. So
anyway, that was tricky. Like sometimes time zones that can be frustrating. So I wanted to ask you a question that is kind of tricky for me. I'm a fan of a TV show that's called Doctor Who, and one of the characters there said that lies is plural and truth is singular. So that's why that character asked another character to say something using just one word. So if we're applying this principle here, and I'm going to ask you, like, if you were to tell us about yourself using just one word, which one would it be?
It's an interesting concept, isn't it? That lies are countable and truth is non-count, if I'm just thinking grammatically. But if I were going to choose a word for myself, I guess I would probably go for an adjective. I would take curious.
Wow, that's interesting. Why have you chosen this one?
Because when I think of in my life, why do I do this and then change to this and then do this and start this? It's because I'm curious about something or interested in about something. That's my motivation. Okay. And to turn that back around to teaching and materials, that's what I mean. Teachers often ask, how can I motivate my students, or what motivates students? And I think if you can tap into their curiosity and interest, that will help them find motivation. So can you create materials that make them want to go further and want to learn more?
Okay, I really love your answer because curiosity, I think it's the main driver of most of the people. So talking about developing materials, when was the first time, or maybe when was the moment when you started creating materials? Do you remember that?
Well, I think for teachers, I think most of us are creating materials from kind of the first week we start teaching, right? You have your book and your lesson plan, and you wish you had something that's not there. And so you make role-playing cards, or you make a worksheet, or maybe you type up some information that you gave students that you'd written on the board, but you realize would be a useful handout. So I think most teachers are organically creating materials all the time. But the first time that I moved from just doing my own things in my own classroom to thinking about, maybe I could write materials that would be useful for someone else, was when I was working at a company in Japan. And we had a set work day from 8:30 to 5:30, but I only had 16 hours of classes per week. And I could not give my students homework because they were working 60, 70 hours a week in the office and went home to families. So there was no grading. So if you take away grading and a lot of the contact hours, I had a lot of free time, actually, but I couldn't leave because that was my set work day. So I got a call from a publisher's representative from Oxford University Press saying, would you like me to stop by and tell you about our materials? And I said, yes, just for something to do that day. So he stopped by and talked about his books, and I was already using Oxford University Press books. And as I used the book, I would make little notes in the book about, oh, this doesn't match the audio script, or, there's a typo here that I circled. And I asked him, will anybody pay me to tell you what these are? And he said, well, actually, yes, we're doing a second edition. And I think I got, $25 or something to send my list of typos. And I thought, I am an important user of materials. But then when the commissioning editor was coming through Japan on a research trip, she reached out and said, can we have a meeting? I'd love to hear from a user of these materials. So we had a 2.5-hour meeting, and I got paid more than $25. And I told her everything about every exercise. This works. I would do this differently. My students always get hung up on this one word, and it's not a good word. And from that, she asked, as the authors do the second edition, they're also adding a workbook. They don't have time to write the teacher's guide. Would you be interested in that? And it's what the feeling of a teacher's guide is I think of it as writing recipes for somebody else's dishes. I mean, it's not my food, but I am trying to explain to somebody else how to make it. But that was the first shift for my trying to imagine, how will a large group of teachers whom I don't know personally and will never meet, how can I make things clear to them? And I had to add, extra activities and little photocopyable activities. So that's when I took some of my ideas and tried to turn them into ideas that other people could use. And that's the materials writing shift, I think, every teacher creates things for their classroom, but it's a shift to create things for somebody else's classroom. Mm-hmm. And not just your colleague, but maybe somebody you will never meet. Maybe somebody who's not even in your country. And now we have this double. Now, every time I'm trying to create something, I'm thinking, well, how would that work in an online class? So can I make materials that will work face-to-face and work online? Or do I need to tag an activity? This is just for Zoom with breakout rooms. Or this also works in a face-to-face classroom, but differently. I think Russia is very much like the United States, right, in size, right, that you do have time zones. And one thing the pandemic did for us is we're all on Zoom, right? I'm on Zoom now. And so that means that a teacher on one end of Russia can have students on the other end of Russia, and you don't have to travel. So I don't think online teaching is going to completely go away. And then you can teach people at their office environment when you're at your home. And so I think that's kind of the next level of materials design is, can we do face-to-face and digital materials together?
It's like 3-dimensional or even more dimensional thinking about creating materials. That's good food for thought. And what do you think is the most exciting thing about creating your own materials?
Well, when you teach, when you devise an activity or you do something, sometimes even by accident in class, that really works. And by works, I mean students get better at English. Or you find a way of adjusting something on the page of a book and just changing it and making it a little better so that students practice more or they enjoy it more or something. And that excitement of, I want to share this. I want to tell other people, oh my gosh, try this. This works really well. Recently in my own writing, I've been working a lot on graded readers, some original stories, but also adapting some classics. And I came to that thinking of short stories that I know and I love, but are not available to second language learners because the language is just way too difficult and old fashioned and there's like strong cultural elements, and but with a little help, they would get to this amazing story. And so the exciting thing about creating materials is you get to share these things, and you can help teachers if you're designing materials that make teachers' lives easier. If you're working directly with students, you can make their lives easier. And that's very gratifying.
Yeah.
So
exciting things. They're always fun. It's like every time we do something, we crave for these things. Like whoa! But also there are some things that are boring, or that frustrate us. So what are the same things about creating materials?
So there are, I don't have a perfect example right to mind, but there are sometimes games or activities that have worked for me, like in one specific context or with one kind of student or one kind of class. And I try to make that generalizable, and I just can't, that it's too complicated or it just doesn't work. And I work really hard on an activity and an editor looks at it and goes, oh, but what if, and they bring up some common scenario, and I think, oh, well, then it wouldn't work. And the easiest materials to create are ones that you have tried out in some version in a classroom. But occasionally I imagine an activity and I think, oh, well, I bet this would work if we did that. And I write the whole thing up, and then sometimes, and it's often another teacher or students try it out, or an editor who says, that doesn't work because, this group finishes 5 minutes before that group, and that group hasn't gotten started. The whole activity fails because now they can't work together. And there's some reason that the activity just doesn't work. So that's frustrating because I feel like, oh, somewhere in there's a good idea, but I just can't translate it into something practical. And the other thing that I find frustrating is information that changes, right? You write about some person and then they do something else, or the information becomes out of date. The web link doesn't work anymore, and this wonderful website you were going to send students to is no longer there. And I think, but 10 years ago, that was a great activity. And it's sometimes hard to let go of it and think, well, it's not a great activity now. You need to replace it with something new. I personally don't like to write about celebrities for this reason. And some publishers and some textbooks say, oh, the students are very interested in celebrities. It's like, right, but between the time I write the story of their life and the time we go to press, they're going to get divorced, or somebody's going to be arrested for something. And then my whole page looks inappropriate, And
how long does it usually take between the moment when you write the material and it gets published finally?
So it depends. It depends who's publishing it. With the university press publishers like Oxford or Cambridge, from the time I start writing to the time it's on the stand, probably 1 to 2 years.
A lot can change in 1 or 2 years.
Right. Well, right. with the commercial publishers like Macmillan and Pearson, they tend to move faster. So more like 4 or 5 months. But it also depends how big the project is. If it's a course book series where you have maybe 4 or 5 levels and a workbook and a teacher's guide and digital and a testing packet, and the website has to have a testing program, because everybody's working on all of these. That's why it can take a few years just to get all the pieces. So when you launch the course book, everything is there. When I'm self-publishing, it's the amount of time I spent doing my work, then I hand it to somebody to edit it. But I'm usually working with friends who I know, and they know my schedule. A couple days, sometimes maybe a week or 2. And then I just wait for a cover and I upload it to places that publish materials, and that takes a day or 2. So probably the fastest I've done books. I was working with a friend of mine at the University of California, Berkeley, on Berkeley runs this large writing MOOC, one of those massive online courses. And we realized that there was no book or materials or website, anything. There was nothing telling students how to be good at being online, right? For a while, people used to talk about, the digital natives and the digital immigrants. It's like, no, there's no digital natives. Everybody has to learn at some point in their life. And a lot of our students were from developing countries. They'd maybe never been in an online course before, and they didn't know Super simple things like how to introduce themselves in a forum. They would write, "Hi," and nobody would click on that. But if they wrote, "Hello from sunny Istanbul," somebody would click on that. So they just needed to know, how do you handle yourself in an online situation of maybe 30,000 students? Hi isn't enough. How do you get help? How do you manage time zones, right? If there are assignments and, the computer is going to cut off at a certain time, how can you be sure you will never be locked out? What do you do about technical difficulties? Maybe you're in a country where the electricity isn't stable. So I thought, okay, this material doesn't exist anywhere. Fine, we'll write it ourselves. And I think we did that in a week. So my friend and I had a day where we spent a couple hours brainstorming all the material we want. We divided up the chapters. You write those, I'll write these. We wrote our chapters. We exchanged our chapters. We got a cover, but the course was ongoing. So we wanted to get the material to students immediately. And I thought, oh my goodness, if we had gone through a traditional publisher, the book would have come out a year later for a new class, but it wouldn't have helped these students now. So, I mean, it was a week of very intense work where we weren't sleeping at night, but we did get a book out in a week. So
that's amazing job. And while you were talking about, different things like even time zones or I don't know, like blackout, like power cuts that might happen or anything, sometimes we need to think outside the box. Since it's like maybe those people who live like in the country within one time zone, it's very difficult for them to understand the concept that someone is there. So it's like while you're writing materials, especially for international use, it's also a good thing to think about local markets.
Yes.
It's like, is there any kind of procedure with official publishers or something to customize a bit those materials?
Some of the big publishers will do local editions. Mostly, if they do local editions, it's for the Middle East market, which is just a lot more strict with not including references to music or film or showing women in sleeveless shirts. But if you get that strict, then your materials are a little dull for the rest of the world that doesn't have those restrictions. But I could imagine if you were a teacher in Moscow, maybe you would want two different versions of an activity for high school students and for university students, right? Because the questions you ask or the role plays that you create might be different for people who live with their parents and people who live independently. With business English materials, we sometimes do different versions for people who've never had a job before, right? The pre-work students in university and those people who have a job now. So they might want different vocabulary or to approach activities differently. So you can, of course, write two different books. But and one thing I want to say in my course to materials writers is a good activity. I mean, good for students, but also good for you as a writer and somebody who has only 24 hours in a day, is to write materials that can be adapted for different contexts. Can you come up with a good activity and change it slightly? So this is okay for 15-year-olds. This is interesting for 25-year-olds. It's the same activity, but maybe you changed some example sentences or you changed the context.
That sounds like a lot of work that you have to put in when you're working with materials and when you're creating anything from scratch.
Yeah.
So again, the question that I did not mention previously, it's like each author, but if we're talking about literature, they have their own lab, their artistic lab. So when it comes to creating materials, I guess like each author has their own lab. So what does your lab look like? It's like, what are the sources of your inspiration? What techniques?
Well, I think once you sort of turn on your materials writer's mind, then everything you come into contact with becomes sort of a source of inspiration. I tend to write a lot of materials for university students and adults, and I live within a 10-minute walk of a university. So when I was writing my TOEFL book, where we're supposed to have authentic sounding conversations between students, there's also a type of reading that's like messages on a message board. And I mean, I went to university, but quite some years ago. I have no idea if what I remember when I was 20 on a bulletin board is what's on a bulletin board now. So I walked down to the university and I sat in the cafeteria, slowly having coffee and a pastry, listening to students. What are they talking about? What are topics of conversation? And I went to a bunch of different bulletin boards and took pictures with my phone. Like, here's the typical message. But a lot of things that used to be physical pieces of writing when I was a student, people selling their books or selling their furniture because they're moving apartments and they're going home for the summer. A lot of that is online now. So what's on the bulletin board are advertisements from companies selling services to students. This will help you study for your law school exams. Do you need a way to relax? And so there's more service announcements geared towards students. So, okay, if I'm going to write materials that are relevant, then they have to reflect that reality. But any conversation I have, as I read articles on the web, I'll think, oh, that's interesting. That would be a great reading passage. And I save the article and I put it in a folder. I have a physical drawer down here where I stick newspaper articles that I think are interesting.
How many articles are there, approximately?
Oh, a lot. and some of them I might never use, right? But that's what I mean about being curious. If everything is interesting, every conversation that you overhear someone having, every time you go to a restaurant and have a meal and you have an interaction with a server, all of those are interesting, right? And that's what people need language for. So that's what I want to bring into my materials, so that the language students are learning feels useful to them.
I really like the concept that you're using, like anything, that inspiration is all around you, and you can take any piece of information and turn it into some kind of idea to use.
Yeah. So don't say anything to me in Russian, because it won't work. But I did spend a little bit of time at one point thinking, oh, maybe I'd like to learn some Russian. And I have the Duolingo app, which I had used for Spanish, and it worked really well for Spanish. So I thought, oh, I'll just change my language to Russian. And it didn't work at all, because they wanted to first start with the Russian alphabet. But in order to teach the characters slowly, all of the sentences and words they were teaching me were kind of stupid. And so I'm feeling like I'm using my brain power to learn a noun that I will never use if I ever go to Russia or speak to a Russian person. And I found that so frustrating, but I couldn't skip ahead because everything then becomes in Cyrillic. So if you don't learn the alphabet, you can't use the rest of the app. Then instead, I was just, browsing along online, and I found an app that said, learn to read Russian in 3 hours. And the language teacher part of me was going, that's not possible. You can't learn anything in 3 hours. So I was curious. So I downloaded it. And what that person did, all of the characters came from street signs and from buildings. So like, here's the name of the something something hotel. And you didn't have to necessarily read all the characters, because you were learning them one or two at a time. And he would just say, well, these characters mean this, but can you read this first letter, right? Or here's the first letter. So which one of these hotels starts with a D sound? And it all felt very useful, because if you go to Russia as a foreigner, you might want to be able to recognize the name of the restaurant that you're looking for, or the name of the hotel.
Or at least the initial letter of it.
Right. And I thought that was a very realistic scenario too, that sometimes when you're learning a new alphabet, you only need a few letters to recognize the word you're looking for. Like, you're in an airport, where is the gate for, the airplane going to Vladivostok? I don't have to read all of the letters in Vladivostok. I just need a few key ones and I'll get it. So even very simple materials for beginners can still be realistic. And from a learner perspective, that felt so much more useful to me.
Okay, so you have to become materials creator, you need to be curious. Source of imagination is everywhere. You need to be realistic with your materials. So try to stick to some easier things that you can find anywhere. Okay, so like I started collecting some tips for those people who are starting to create material. So what kind of advice would you give to a novice teacher, or maybe to a teacher who decided to create or adapt materials? I can't say for the first time, since we discussed that.
Because I think teachers are already, it's a very rare teacher who has not already created materials of some kind already. I would say the most important thing is to give your materials to someone who is not you, right? A friend who's a teacher, and give them the materials, and don't then verbally explain it to them, right? Because that's just because they're your friend. Can you hand them a document or email them a document that they can take into class and use, and did it work? And then get their feedback. You said to give them 10 minutes, but actually they were done with the discussion in 3 minutes. So I just moved on. And you think, maybe I should change the direction line 3 to 5 minutes. Timing is really hard. we imagine times, but sometimes until you try it with real students in a classroom, something you thought was a 10-minute activity actually takes 25 minutes. That's very important for a teacher to know, because when they pick up somebody else's materials, they're trying to fit those into a 60-minute lesson or a 90-minute lesson. And if your timing is way off, that throws their whole lesson off, and that's stressful for them. So get somebody else to try out your materials is one piece of advice. But for actual designing, I would say come back to, is this language useful? And realistic, maybe, but I think useful is more important than realistic. I don't mind students doing something in the classroom, like a drill, that would never happen sort of in real life or, out on the street. But if it's useful, if repeating this pattern 20 times in a drill-like game or a game-like drill will make it easy for me to turn around and use it out on the street, that's useful. I don't care if it's realistic. So is the language useful? Is the vocabulary useful? If you're going to learn 10 new words in this lesson, are they 10 good words, right? That will connect you to the world and connect you to other people that you might use again. And if it's just one word you need for one article and you'll never need it again, maybe you could just gloss that or give a translation and move on and not spend a lot of time focusing on it. But the very, very basic thing that I see teachers doing with their own materials that they probably would not accept in published materials, if you're trying to practice, I don't know, a grammar point or a tense, and people write unconnected sentences. So sentence 1, Peter is buying apples. Sentence 2, John goes to the beach. And for a student, you naturally wonder about the language, like Peter, who is Peter? Why is he buying apples? Is he going to make something? Is he hungry? Is that all that? So they want there to be a story behind all the language. So if you had one paragraph about one person or one situation, but you divided that into individual sentences and worked on the tenses that you were trying to work on, but your whole worksheet, your whole piece of paper was about one context or one incident, then it's easier for the student to believe they're learning something useful.
You have your own publishing house, Ways Good Press.
Yes.
And you had a wonderful plenary on TESL about publishing materials and so on and so forth. So if since all teachers at some point of time we start creating our own materials, and maybe we start thinking about like publishing them and making them available to larger number of
yeah.
teachers. So what would you suggest to those who want to start? Whether they should go to a publishing house or they
Well,
should.
I think whether you go to a publishing house or do it yourself also depends on the materials themselves and the scope. I mean, I do have my own little publishing company now. I publish anything that I want to, but there are kinds of projects I can't do because I don't have access to a recording studio with 6 different accents, or I can't get video made. I don't have any way to physically bundle MP3 files and connect them with my book. I don't have $3 million to build an LMS system. So if I'm working on a course book, that has 6 levels and different authors and all these pieces and whatnot, I would absolutely go to a publisher. If I'm doing a graded reader, which publishers also do, I would actually prefer to self-publish that because I have my own ideas about teaching reading that I want the control, right? I decided with a reader, I don't want any vocabulary words glossed in the middle of the text, and I don't want any exercises to interrupt the story. And if a teacher wants exercises to interrupt the story, that's fine. Then they shouldn't buy my book. They should buy somebody else's book. I mean, there are many ways to teach and learn. It doesn't have to be just my way. But I want some guidance into the story and then to read the story alone, and then we'll have some processing after it. So if that's how I believe reading should work, then I will self-publish that. And a reader is it's just text and some images. So I can easily buy from stock photo sites a high quality, legal to use image and put it in my book. And then the material and the thinking is all mine. And I add a cover and we're done for a paperback or an ebook. So that kind of sort of easy to create piece that and I would say they're shorter projects that just not as many pieces and elements as big textbook series. When I did my TOEFL book, oh my goodness, I mean the audio recording requirements of that way beyond me. I do not have the resources to hire that many voice actors to do the audio. I can't make a digital book on a platform that will work in all countries. So I'm happy to give that kind of project to a publisher. And the kinds of things that I'm self-publishing are also things that traditional publishers really aren't that interested in. They're more interested in large course book series because that's what makes them the most money. Oxford University Press actually just dropped their line of professional books for teachers that were widely respected. So Waste Goose Press is thinking of perhaps reaching out to those series editors and saying, I'd publish your books.
That would be wonderful. That would be wonderful.
Right? But a teacher resource book, I mean, some teachers buy them. It tends to be libraries or MA programs that buy them, and people learn from them, but they don't earn as much money as a book that every student is going to buy a copy of. And publishers have, larger expenses too. I mean, they have offices in major cities and electric bills, and they are paying the voice talent and the recording and all the digital stuff. So they need a higher return per book than I do. I mean, my office is my house. I'm already going to pay for my electricity and eat my food. So I can afford to sell fewer books and still make money off them. Whereas the publishers need to sell a lot of books or it's not financially viable for them. So I see a kind of natural divide of let the publishers do the large expensive things and then let the small publishers like me or independent teachers fill in the holes, right? And do those materials that you still want, but maybe aren't financially viable for a large company to take on, or certainly things for local context. If you want to do something that's just of interest to, second year nursing students in the western half of Russia, right? Pearson's not going to take that on. It's not a big enough market. but maybe in your university or your collection of universities, there are enough nursing students at the second year who need this kind of materials, and you know what they need. So you can make more targeted materials too.
Yeah, that's wonderful. It's like we're not competitors. Like when you're trying to self-publish something, it's like you're not fighting with a great giant in the publishing house. You're just doing your job. You're filling the gaps that were not covered.
Right. And that the big publishers don't want to do those books. They don't mind if they exist. I mean, I've never had a big publisher look down on me or criticize me or feel threatened by anything that I'm doing. And I still happily work for other publishers, just on different kinds of projects.
That's good. So I think that should be the final question. So you're going to be the speaker for the Autumn 2-day online school with Meet.
Yes.
And so, of course, there are people who are still thinking, it's like, should I go? Should I not? So they're in two minds. Maybe you can give them like a sneak peek of what we're going to do there, so they can.
I would say the one thing to think about is for materials creation, because like we already talked about, every teacher is creating materials, and you may decide to publish them and you may not decide to publish them, but the materials that you create and use in your class, you still want those to be good. And the principles that we're going to be talking about will cover materials that you create, whether you publish them or not. So it will make you a better creator of resources for your own classroom and possibly for other people's classrooms. And we'll also come into that by looking at published materials and talking about, where are they strong, where are they weak? And if they are weak, what can you do about that? So I think it's also useful for anybody who uses published materials, but would like to make them a little better. Where do you change a direction line, and how can you extend an activity, or what can you do with an exercise that almost works? So we'll be looking at that kind of question as well. So I think if anybody either uses materials or ever makes their own materials, hopefully they'll get some really practical advice of what they can do in their classrooms. And I mean, all of my workshops, I hope, are super practical. I mean, it's not a lot of, history of materials development in the world. It's like, what can you do that will be of use to you and use for your students?
Thank you very much, Dorothy. I think everyone after this, they must join us, because it's going to be amazing. Thank you very much for this delightful talk. You have a whole day to live. And we in Russia, we are obviously finishing our day and coming back home.